Good morning. I am delighted and honored to have been asked by Pastor Keitha to share a message with you this morning. My name is Kathleen Getchell, and I serve as pastor alongside the King's Court Free Methodist Church family as we minister to one another and to those in our neighborhood here in Kingston, Ontario. I want to begin this morning by asking you a question. How many women are listed in Jesus' genealogy? In Matthew's account of Jesus' lineage, how many women are listed? If you guessed, or if you knew that it was 5, you would be correct. But more than this, listed among those 5 women, or of those 5 women, were the enemies of the Israelites, the Jewish people, the Canaanites like Tamar and Rahab, and a Moabite like Ruth. These also make up Jesus' genealogy. But perhaps the most shocking is the reality that the women in Jesus' family tree also included adulterers and prostitutes. How does that make you feel? To hear that Jesus' lineage is not strictly Jewish, or that his great-grandmother, 31 years down, if I did my math correctly, was a prostitute. Are you scandalized by such a thought? Or are you encouraged? I'll leave you with that question. My prayer with every message that I am privileged to share is that if we need a word of hope and comfort, that we will receive precisely that. And that if we need a word that challenges us and convicts us, that we too would receive that. Each contributing to our transformation, to our restoration and reconciliation. And I pray that is true for each of us this morning. When Keitha asked if I would share a message on a character from Scripture, I thought of these 5 women listed in Jesus' genealogy. And so this morning I thought that we could consider either afresh or anew why Matthew broke with patriarchal tradition and named Tamar among the 5 women significant to the lineage of Jesus. The story of Tamar is found in the book of Genesis, chapter 38. It begins by explaining that Judah, the son of Jacob, the brother of Joseph, you know, the one with the technicolor coat, who he convinced his brothers not to kill, but rather to sell to the Ishmaelites. This Judah, brother of Joseph, son of Jacob, met a daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua and married her. Marrying a Canaanite woman was not considered one of the wisest decisions that Judah made. The Canaanites were corrupting the Israelites with their pagan worship, and it was God's plan to lead the Israelites out of Canaan. Judah married the Canaanite girl anyway. And together they had 3 sons. The oldest, followed by Onan, and then his youngest brother, Shelah. When his oldest son was ready to marry, Judah chose a wife for him, as was the custom. He chose yet again another Canaanite woman. He chose a Canaanite by the name Tamar to be Er's wife. Tamar means date, which is interesting because date was a symbol of fertility. Er was not a nice guy. If you reverse the 2 letters of his name, you get the Hebrew term for evil, and that is how he is described. Before they could have children, dies. Now, in situations where the husband dies without leaving a male heir, the Israelite custom, the law, is that the next oldest son is to marry the widow, to have a child with her that would become the legal heir to his older brother's estate and carry on the family name, as well as to care and provide for his mother. This was the law, and it's codified in Deuteronomy. You can read about it. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 to 10. Now, it may seem a very strange rule to us today, but in a patriarchal society, it was a redemptive step, ensuring that there was a kindred redeemer offering provision and protection and a place for a widow. Without a husband, a son in this society, a widow would most likely be destitute. This law was a step, albeit an imperfect step, towards justice. Justice for the marginalized and oppressed. Justice for women. If Tamar would be provided for, the property would be preserved in the Hebrew family of Judah, and the family name would continue on. And so Judah instructs Onan, whose name means the viral one, to marry Tamar and give her a son. A son that would not legally be his, but rather his deceased older brother's. And it turns out that Onan was fine with using Tamar for his own sexual gratification, but he refused to have a child with her. Not one that he would need to support. Not one that wouldn't even technically be considered his, but rather his dead brother's. Not one that would lessen his share of the inheritance. And so Onan ensured that every time he slept with Tamar, that he cast his seed on the ground. He used her. He was called to care for his brother's widow, to provide for her, but he abused her. God saw this and declared it wicked. And the text reads, "So the Lord put him to death." However this is unpacked, the point is that God takes how we treat, care, and provide for one another very seriously. With Tamar seemingly unable to conceive and both Judah's sons now dead, he instructs Tamar to return to her father until his youngest son is old enough to marry. Judah, however, is not motivated by concern or care for his daughter-in-law. Blind to the evilness of his own sons, he considers Tamar to be cursed. And so he lies to her. He has no intention of giving his youngest and last remaining son to her. It would mean that he might potentially die as well. By refusing to follow the law, Judah is essentially committing the same sin as Onan. Judah chose Tamar for He is responsible to care for her, to provide for her. Tamar was not allowed to simply marry another man. Only Judah, only her father-in-law could determine whom and when she could marry. Judah held the power, and he was abusing it in a way that oppressed Tamar. The righteous thing to do, the legal requirement, is that his son Shelah marry Tamar. But instead, Judah sends her home to her father's house, with no intentions of making plans for her return. Tamar, having to return to her father's home, would have fueled the perception that she is a woman cursed. Women without children were a disgrace, wrongly perceived as being punished by God. Judah's actions have contributed to Tamar's marginalization. Tamar is not the one guilty of anything here. Tamar is not the one being punished by God. Can you imagine how devastated and desperate Tamar must feel? She has been abused by those meant to protect her, the men in her life, the religious community, the people of God. She is used and abused and left destitute. A woman alone without a husband, no sons, and so no status, no means to survive. She is cast out from the community, excluded, looked down upon. She, the innocent one, condemned, judged, cast out, and left destitute by the very ones who were called to care and provide for her. And for years, Tamar lived under this bondage and marginalization, waiting and hoping for Judah to send for her to marry his son Shelah, to make things right. It becomes clear, however, after Judah's wife dies, that this is not going to happen. Have you ever waited graciously for a wrong to be made right, for justice to prevail, hoping that someone would come to their senses, hoping that someone would speak up and speak out and make things right, for justice to prevail, for people to see the error of their ways and do the right thing, only to watch as they continue on as though nothing ever happened. No one thinking any less of them, but looking at you as the condemned one. This was Tamar's experience, and she could not endure it any longer. She was suffering. And so desperate, she takes matters into her own hands. She knew the route that Judah traveled to visit his friends and shear his sheep, and so she devised a plan. She would disguise herself as a prostitute and wait alongside the road for Judah to pass by. Israelites, as the people of God, were called to be set apart. It would be a sin for Judah to solicit a prostitute, though prostitution itself was neither illegal or uncommon in ancient Near Eastern culture. Judah does pass by, and he notices her. But with the veil covering her face, he does not recognize her to be his daughter-in-law, Tamar. Judah solicits her for sex. Now, to be clear, Judah approached her. She did not pursue him. She did not initiate. They negotiate a price. A young goat from his flock. I find it very interesting that the request is for a young goat. A young goat is called a kid. And if they had simply provided her a kid in the first place, they would not find themselves in this situation. Obviously, Judah does not have a goat with him. So Tamar asks for a deposit. She requests Judah's seal, his cord, and his staff. These were essentially his ID. She would hold on to these to ensure that Judah made payment. The seal would have been like his personal stamp. The staff would have had his personal emblem carved on it, as well as the names of the lineage of the family carved into it. Tamar's plan was to ensure that she had a son whose name would be added to that staff. Tamar and Judah slept together. Have you ever been so wounded, so hurt, abused, rejected, That seeing no other way out, you resort to desperate measures that you might not otherwise have ever considered? Perhaps not, but many people have. Often as a result of the ways that they have been marginalized, oppressed, and abused. Judah returned home. Tamar changed back into her widow's garb and went back to her father's house. As promised, Judah sent a friend with the young goat to the prostitute as payment and to get back his precious personal items. There was, however, no prostitute to be found. His friends asked around, and the people responded with, "What are you talking about? There has been no prostitute here." When his friend reported back to Judah, Judah decided that it was probably better to let her keep the things rather than risk looking like a laughingstock in public as he searched for a prostitute. 3 months later, Judah gets word that Tamar is pregnant. Judah doesn't ask any questions. He knew it was not by his youngest son, so she must have either committed adultery or prostituted herself. As the head of the family, he had the right to pass judgment on her, and he condemns her to death by burning. He had the option of sparing her life, but instead, he sentences her to a particularly heinous death. He condemns her for participating in the very same act he did. Talk about speck and plank problems. He was about to kill Tamar for a sin he was guilty of. Do we ever find ourselves quick to judge or to condemn someone for something that we ourselves have been or are guilty of? I'm reminded of that wise cliche that when we have one finger pointing in judgment and condemnation of another, we have 3 pointing back at us. When the officials came to get Tamar, she handed them Judah's seal, cord, and staff. And she makes this pointed assertion: "I am pregnant by the man who owns these. See if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are." Can you imagine Judah's response? His reaction? It took being confronted with his own sin to stop his hypocrisy. Judah recognized that not only was he guilty of the very same thing he was accusing Tamar of, but he was guilty of much worse. Guilty of soliciting prostitution, which have been much worse for him as an Israelite. Guilty of not providing for Tamar, of not ensuring an heir for the lineage continues. Judah was guilty of injustices against a human being. It doesn't matter that she was not Jewish. It doesn't matter that she hadn't borne him a child. It doesn't matter that she was a Canaanite, an enemy of the Israelites. It doesn't matter because she was created by God in the image of God and loved by God. Tamar knew her rights. She had a right to a child through her husband's family. Had a right to an heir. And though her deceit and unorthodox actions are not applauded, her faith is. She was a woman who risked her life to fulfill her duty and to ensure that her family's lineage continued. And in doing so, she gave birth to twins, Zerah and Perez. And so the lineage of David continues, and Perez becomes the 34th great-grandfather of Jesus. Tamar was abused, rejected, abandoned, marginalized, and oppressed. But she ended up the matriarch of the Messiah. She is listed, she is named in the genealogy of Jesus. If you have ever felt yourself feeling like Tamar, wounded, hurt, abused, unwelcomed, disgraced, ignored by family, looked down upon by the church, may you find comfort in knowing that, like Tamar, though others may dismiss you, malign you, marginalize you, Jesus desires to embrace and heal you, elevating you to your rightful position, a joint heir with Christ. All those who trust in Jesus have their names written on the great shepherd's staff, members of the family of God. We can be deceived into thinking, into believing that God can never use someone like us, that we have too many scandalous skeletons in our closet, or that perhaps we're simply not good enough. May we be encouraged to know that it doesn't matter our backgrounds, our family history, our ethnicity, our social status, our orientation, or even what past sins we may have committed. If we are willing, God will work in and through us to be the harbingers of justice, conduits of blessing and flourishing. If we are willing to walk in the will and ways of Christ, then we are invited to partner with him in the mission of the restoration and reconciliation of all things. The church, followers of Christ, are the very people called to care for the least of these, to fight against injustice, to bring freedom to the oppressed, to set the lonely in families, to provide for the care and inclusion of all people. And yet I can't help but wonder if at times our own attitude and actions or lack thereof reflect more of Judah's heart than Jesus's. Are there instances where we are clinging to power and privilege and withholding our care? Do we as individuals, do we as the church implicitly or explicitly send people away? Do we exclude others? Do we sometimes fall into the same trap as Judah, looking down on others instead of looking up to God? Quick to point the finger, to judge, to condemn, oblivious to the three fingers that are pointing back at us. If you are weighted down by the guilt and shame of desperate choices that you have made in desperate times, or if you stand convicted of your own judgmental attitudes, may you turn towards Jesus and find comfort in knowing that Jesus forgives. I think of how Judah represented the people of God and how we, as Christ's church, represent God. And I am reminded of the verse from 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 14. If my people, who are called by my name, humble themselves, not thinking of themselves as better than others, and pray, seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways of injustice, marginalization, racism, sexism, defamation, deceit, classism, oppression, ableism, lack of love. Then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. Grace, grace, God's grace, grace that is greater than all our sin. May we turn to Christ and receive that healing grace that freedom-giving grace, the grace that brings about our liberation and our salvation, that we might be conduits of the blessing and flourishing of God. Amen.